Hey there everyone. Today we're going to learn how to control the secret little code that's in the back of every web page on any browser. Hope you'll join. Hello there everyone. I'm super glad you could join me again today to join us on our discussion on the HTML DOM, or Document Object Model, and the CSS Box Model. Now, these things are going to be our primary focus because they'll help us become kind of like Kung Fu masters for programming, and in this case, HTML. We're kind of going for a Neo realizing he can change the matrix kind of moment. So, even though this stuff will be kind of boring, I really do hope that it will be able to help you out in understanding exactly how a web page works. So you may have seen me jumping around between these two tabs and seen this graphic on the second one. This is actually going to be what we're primarily going to be looking at for the Document Object Model, or the HTML DOM. We'll just refer to it to the DOM as from now on, just because saying Document Object Model over and over again is going to get really repetitive. But to get straight into the explanation, we got to think of every HTML page as an element. Imagine we have a box like this white one right here, and inside of it, just like our elements in the previous lessons we learned about, these boxes each have their own attributes, properties, and if you have enough of these boxes inside of each other with their own separate attributes and properties, eventually you get a pattern that looks exactly like this, what you would call a tree in most cases, kind of in the same way that a tree branches out in a bunch of different directions. In computer science, you'll constantly be finding trees of this sort as information gets filled out in systems and things start to essentially coalesce into this giant collection that will either look like a web or a branch. Alright, so now let's actually dig into the definitions of, let's actually dig into exactly what we're looking at with this graph. So, as I had explained earlier, we can think of the entire HTML document acting as a single element with blocks inside that have their own attributes as well. Now, let's go ahead and look at exactly what those items are. So, here we'll see at the top we have our document, which actually represents what I was explaining this whole box as being, and then we go a level down. And on this first layer, we find the root element, or the HTML tag. So far in CodePen, we haven't had to mess with this element because CodePen takes care of all that extra work for us. CodePen is a great platform for beginners in that way, and it's awesome that it does that, because really, when you're programming a web page and having to put the same line of code in every time, no matter what, it becomes redundant. Why not automate the process? But continuing forward, past our HTML, you can imagine or actually start drawing out boxes on a piece of paper if it will help you along with this. But we have our HTML box, and inside of this we have nowadays two main blocks that are always going to need to be present to have a formal full web page. Now, these two elements will actually be the head and the body tags. Now, before we dig too deep into those, you can actually visualize the web page as a human body. Traditionally, there would be a mix of a header, a body, and a footer. You don't see the footer as often these days just because it has changed with the entire infrastructure of the internet, but we're going to primarily focus on both the head and the body to understand exactly how our web pages work. So, jumping right in, we're actually going to be taking a shallow approach towards head because we're going to hold off on doing a full analysis for a time where we'll have a platform where we can actually mess with the head and all of its properties. So, for the time being, a quick overview of what the head does for an HTML document and how it affects our web page breaks down into about four main things. Those 4 things will be any linkage of any files of either CSS or JavaScript, as well as the title and language notation for the web page. These all will play into how well the web page does on the Google search engine if you're worried about that sort of thing, as well as providing some pretty important information to your average web user. Now with this, with these elements inside of our head, which you can kind of think of as doing the thinking for our document, we can actually portray what is going on with this smoking body. Am I right? So with our head covered, we're actually going to go ahead and move on to the body. And now that we are focused on the body, I'd like to say, if you've been following along with the previous lessons, there's actually not too much different that we'll learn here. The body essentially breaks down into a collection of these different elements that all have their separate attributes, whether it's links, whether it's alternative properties that read text to some computer that scans a web page. Here, the body is just a collection of the different elements that will eventually be rendered and interpreted by the root element of our page. Now that we've finished the first half of this video with focusing on the HTML DOM, we're actually going to go ahead and transition over into the CSS Box Model. Now, for this, all you're going to need is Google Chrome. Any web page works, and with this, we'll actually be able to look at how the blocks in our web pages move around and how they can be positioned exactly where they are on the web page. So an effective way for anyone to be able to look at exactly how the CSS Box Model works at home is by opening up Google Chrome and either right-clicking on any element or any block on the page and hitting this inspect button down at the bottom. Now, if you're the type of person who likes to learn shortcut keys, go ahead and type in Control-Shift-I, and like this, we'll actually get a view into the internals of the web page in a way. Now, we're only seeing what the servers send our way, but even with this, all of this interpreted data, we can actually gain control of different blocks in the CSS and actually see how they work. Now, the part we're going to be interested in today is this little block down here. On everybody's screen, you might be seeing a different layout from what's seen here, but just ensure that you're under the Elements section of these tabs right here, and you, just through some looking around through the Styles sub-tab, will be seeing this box pop up here. Now, these are going to be the primary things we're going to be focusing on for the CSS Box Model. The box model literally refers to every element being a block, and all of these blocks being able to share three key items that help differentiate them, essentially. So, to begin with, we'll be starting with the most outward of these properties, which is the margin. You can kind of think of a margin as this invisible force field that pushes things away from you and out and about. So, for example, with this section right here, this little search bar, you see this blank area in between this bar, the top of the screen, the logo to the right, and the area below. The reason this little invisible area is there is because of the margin for that element. So let's see if we can actually get it to highlight. It doesn't, but it actually allows for us to highlight the other property, which is the padding. The padding kind of works like the margin, but in the opposite sense. It creates this force field that pens things inside and only allows for the background or a border to be shown there. And speaking of borders, that will actually be the third property of every block in the CSS Box Model. So if we want to break it all down, we have a margin defining the area outside the block, the padding defining part of the area, the inner ring of the block on the inside, the border, which defines the border, And inside of all of this, we have our content. So at this point, you're probably asking yourself, we've learned all these fancy new acronyms, we've learned these fancy new names and properties. What do we do with them? I'll actually go ahead and show you. Right now, if you've already got this Inspect Element tab open in Google Chrome, we're going to go ahead and scroll up from this visualizer for the CSS Box Model and go to the top of this tab. Here, we're actually going to go ahead and manipulate those three properties for one of the selected elements. And let's say we'll do this side navigation bar right here. With this, we're going to go ahead and try and essentially hack the website for ourselves to see and manipulate the three things that were stated earlier, which are our margin, our border, and our padding. So let's go ahead and add a rule for, let's see if I can get this to add a new rule. We're just going to go ahead and click here, and I'm going to change the background color in this case. Now, this is a little bit of a sneak peek into what actual CSS will look like, but if you've joined in the earlier lessons and worked with some of the inline styling, it will be exactly the same. So we're going to go ahead and change our background color to blue. And in this case, we have this nice bright blue that doesn't really work with the rest of the site, but hey, we're just hacking around. No harm in having these pretty offensive colors attack our eyes. So from here, I'm also going to go ahead and mess with the margin to begin with. So our margin will have an added 50 px or 50 pixels, and because the border of the actual block, its actual width and height is defined to be an exact pixel length, it pushed everything in so that it could create an outward margin. Now let's see what happens if we change this from a margin to padding. And when we change this, we have the same squished in center, but instead of the outside of the box being shown, it's still technically the inside. And let's just go ahead, delete this rule, and in this case, I'll add a border. And for border, the shorthand for a single border command is really weird. So we're going to go ahead and just jump into the border color property, just so I can show you guys what it looks like to mess with the border. And for the border color, I'm going to go ahead and choose red. And then for my border width, guess I can't type, border width, I will be changing it to 20 px. And for some odd reason, we're not having anything happen. Let's go ahead and test it out with a different element. Here, we have our box for picked pen headers. Let's see if we can find that CSS property. I don't see it in here. So let's go ahead and just find another block that'll allow for us to do this. So here, let's add a new property. There we go. So 2px, I'm just going to do the shorthand. Solid. 20px, and then I'm going to choose the color yellow. Now you'll see it pop up, half of it's disappearing. That has to do with other things in the website. But if there's any takeaways from today, what I want you to do is actually review exactly how the HTML DOM works, how that plays into the CSS box model that we had just watched, and how you can use these new properties and understanding of a web page to improve your own web pages at home. So that about covers it for today. Next week, later on in the week, we'll actually be focusing on some specific HTML elements or tags that have to do with the organizing of a web page, and just some tips and tricks on how to keep our code clean throughout these large projects that we're going to be building.